It was a lovely, quiet afternoon at the Horizon truck stop, a familiar haven for truckers on long hauls. The air was filled with the aroma of coffee and fried food, and the low hum of conversation provided a comforting backdrop. Ray Carter, a retired Marine and seasoned truck driver, sat at the counter nursing his coffee and enjoying a rare moment of peace. This place was more than just a pit stop. It was a community where everyone looked out for one another. That peace was shattered, however, by the thunder roar of motorcycles pulling in. In another parking lot, a group of 6 bikers clad in leather jackets adorned with the emblem of a coiled serpent rolled in with an air of confidence. They were the Iron Serpents, a notorious group known for their wild antics and troublemaking ways. At the helm was Blade Morrison, a man whose reputation for intimidation often preceded him. Blade and his crew dismounted their bikes with the swagger of men who believed they owned every space they entered. Inside, the regulars exchanged easy glances. Lisa, a young waitress with a kind smile, froze mid-step as the gang strode into the diner. Pete, the manager, gave a cautious nod in their direction, hoping to avoid trouble, but trouble was exactly what the Iron Serpents had come looking for. Ree watched silently, his keen eyes assessing the situation. He'd seen men like them before, loud, brash, and full of bluster. He didn't move, didn't say a word, but his presence alone was enough to calm those around him. Ree was the kind of man who commanded respect without demanding it. He was the kind of man who commanded respect without demanding it. The bikers wasted no time establishing their dominance. Blade strolled to the counter, eyeing the patrons with a smirk. "Nice little setup you got here," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. His hulking right-hand man, Tank, leaned against the jukebox, punching buttons as if he owned the place. The rest of the gang spread out, laughing and sharing crude jokes, filling the room with their energy. Lisa approached cautiously, her notepad trembling in her hand. "What can I do to help?" she asked, her voice soft and kind. "I get for you?" she asked Blade, trying to keep her voice steady. Blade grinned, leaning in closer than necessary. "How about your number, sweetheart?" he said, his gang erupting into laughter. Lisa's cheeks flushed, and she stepped back. Unsure how to respond, she was just trying to do her job before she could say anything. Mac, an older trucker sitting nearby, spoke up. "Leave the girl alone," he said. "She's just trying to do her job." Blade turned his attention to Mac. His smile faded, and he snapped, "Who asked you, old man?" The room fell silent, the tension thick. In the air, Ray set his coffee cup down and stood up. The movement was subtle, but it drew everyone's attention. He didn't say anything yet, but his presence was impossible to ignore. Blade noticed and sized him up. "You got something to say?" he asked, his tone challenging. Ree's voice was calm but firm. "How about you show a little respect?" The bikers laughed, but there was an edge of uncertainty in their reaction. Blade stepped closer to Ree, trying to intimidate him. "Respect from us you must." Ray didn't back down. He met Blade's gaze without flinching. "I'm not new here, but you are. Around here, we don't tolerate this kind of behavior." The bikers exchanged glances, their bravado faltering. Ray's words weren't loud, but they carried weight. Still, Blade wasn't ready to back down. He nodded toward Pete, who was standing nervously behind the counter. "This is your place, Ultimer Pete," he said kindly. "I just manage it, Blade." He smiled. "Oh, don't mind us. We'll just make ourselves comfortable without waiting for a response." The gang began to spread out, causing minor chaos wherever they went. Tank grabbed a chair and turned it backward, sitting in it as if he were claiming territory. Another biker started rummaging through a rack of magazines, tossing them onto the floor. Lisa tried to stay out of their way, but one of the bikers deliberately blocked her path. "Oh, where's that smile, honey?" he sneered. He tightened his grip on the situation. He had hoped his earlier words would be enough, but it was clear the Iron Serpents were testing boundaries. He stepped forward, his posture calm but commanding. "That's enough," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. Blade turned to face him, his expression a mix of amusement and irritation. "You sure about that, Grandpa? You might want to sit this one out before you get hurt." Ray didn't blink. "I've faced worse than you," he said simply. The room was silent, all eyes on the two men, the tension palpable. The atmosphere was thick with tension, but Ree remained calm and collected. His demeanor seemed to irritate Blade even more. The gang leader leaned in, lowering his voice to a menacing growl. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he said, his eyes narrowing. Ray's lips curved into a faint smile. "Neither do you," before Blade could respond. Jimmy, another trucker who had been sitting quietly, stood up. Then Mac joined him. One by one, the other truckers in the diner rose to their feet. It was a silent show of solidarity. The Iron Serpents looked around, their confidence wavering. They had expected to intimidate a few individuals, not face a united front. The others looked around, their confidence wavering. They had expected to intimidate a few individuals, not face a united front. Blad's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. For the first time, he seemed to realize he might have underestimated the situation. Ray took a step closer. His voice was low but firm. "This isn't your playground," he said. "You're going to sit down, behave, cave, and leave these people alone, or we're going to have a problem." The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of their next move. The balance of power had shifted, and it was clear that they were no longer in control. Blade hesitated, his bravado clashing with the reality of the situation. Finally, he raised his hands in mock surrender. "All right, old man, you win this round," he said, his tone laced with sarcasm. Ray didn't respond, he didn't need to. The message was clear, and the Iron Serpents knew it. For now, they would back off, but the tension in the room suggested this wasn't over yet. The Iron Serpents retreated to their booth, their movements still as bold as ever but noticeably more subdued. Blade sat at the head of the table, his eyes fixed on Ray, simmering with a hint of resentment. Tank muttered something under his breath, prompting Blade to smirk and nod as if formulating a plan. Despite their temporary compliance, it was clear that the bikers weren't ready to let this go. Lisa cautiously resumed her duties, doing her best to avoid the gang's learning stares. Pete, still shaken, whispered to Sarah, the older waitress, was going to keep an eye on things for a while. Meanwhile, Ray returned to his seat at the counter. He was feeling pretty tense, but he kept it to himself. He knew men like Blade all too well. They're arrogant, dangerous, and they don't like to admit defeat. Jimmy leaned over and spoke quietly to Ree. "You think they're going to cause more trouble?" Ree nodded slightly. "They're testing the waters. People like that don't back down easily." Jimmy sighed. He glanced toward the bikers. "Well, if they try anything, you've got backup." Ray gave him a little nod of appreciation. A small nod of appreciation rippled around the room. Other truckers exchanged subtle gestures of agreement, a silent bond among them. They understood each other, a mutual understanding that they'd stand together if things got out of hand at the Iron Serpent's booth. Blade leaned back in his seat, casually drumming his fingers on the table. "You see that guy?" he muttered to Tank, nodding toward Ree. "Tries to look like a hero, but he's just an old man with guts," Tank chuckled. "I'll give him that, but he's biting off more than he can chew." Blade's smirk widened. "Let's see how tough he really is." One of the other bikers, a wiry man nicknamed Razor, leaned forward. "What's the plan, boss?" Blade's voice dropped to a whisper, but his tone was sharp and deliberate. "We let him think he's got the upper hand, then we remind him who's in charge." Razor grinned wickedly, and the bikers nodded in agreement, and their collective energy shifted. Their earlier unease was replaced with a renewed sense of mischief. A few minutes later, Lisa approached their table, hesitantly carrying a tray of drinks. She set them down carefully, avoiding eye contact as she turned to leave. Blade reached out and grabbed her wrist. "Hang on a second," he said in a friendly tone. Lisa froze, her pulse racing. "Yes," she said softly. Blade's smile was all teeth. "How about you sit down and join us? We could use some company," he said kindly. "Company?" Lisa shook her head, trying to pull her wrist free. "I can't," she said softly. "I have work to do." Blade tightened his grip, his tone darkening. "I wasn't asking," he said. Ree noticed the exchange. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, and began walking toward the booth. The other truckers watched closely, their muscles tensing as they prepared to follow. Ray stopped a few feet from the table. His gaze was locked on Blade. "Let her go," he said calmly. Blade glanced up at him. His smirk, "Are you going to lecture me again, Grandpa Ray?" he asked, returning her gaze with a gentle smile. "Let her go." Blade held his stare for a moment, then released her wrist with a flourish. Lisa's eyes widened with a hint of both happiness and fear. Quickly stepping away, she looked back at him, her eyes still wide with emotion. Ree stayed where he was, his presence alone enough to keep the bikers in check for now. Blade leaned back in his seat, chuckling to himself. "You've got a lot of nerve, old man," he teased. "But you're making a mistake." S' voice was steady. "The only mistake being made here is yours. Walk away while you still can." Blade's laughter grew louder, drawing the attention of everyone in the diner. "You hear this guy," he said to his crew. "He thinks he's the sheriff or something." Ray didn't respond. He simply turned and walked back to his seat. His quiet confidence spoke louder than words. Blade watched him go. His smile faded as frustration began to set in. Tank leaned in. What now, boss? Blade's jaw tightened. He'll be back, bless him. He can't keep this act up forever. Meanwhile, while Lisa returned to the counter, her hands trembling as she poured a fresh cup of coffee for Ree, she said quietly, "Thank you." Ree gave her a reassuring nod and said, "You're safe here, don't let them scare you." Lisa managed a small smile, though her eyes betrayed her lingering fear. Pete, who had been observing from behind the counter, stepped forward. "Ray," he said, "I appreciate what you're doing, but these guys, they're dangerous, maybe we should call the police?" Ray shook his head. "Not yet, let's see how this plays out." Pete hesitated, but ultimately deferred to Ray's judgment. He'd seen firsthand how the retired Marine handled himself, and he trusted his instincts. Still, the tension in the room was palpable, and everyone knew it was only a matter of time before things escalated. The Iron Serpents remained in their booth, their rowdy laughter gradually growing quieter as they whispered among themselves. Blade's eyes never left. Ree's expression was a mix of anger and calculation. Whatever he was planning, it was clear he wasn't going to let this slide as the minutes ticked by. The truckers, though outwardly calm, were on high alert. Their solidarity was evident in the way they exchanged subtle nods and glances. They knew that trouble was brewing, and they were ready to stand together when the time came. Ree sat back in his seat, his posture relaxed but his mind sharp. He'd been in similar situations before, tense standoffs where the slightest misstep could lead to chaos. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he was prepared for one if it became necessary. For now, all he could do was wait. The diner settled into an uneasy quiet, though the tension hung thick in the air. Blade and his gang remained at their booth, pretending to enjoy their drinks, but clearly plotting their next move. Ray was seated at the counter, appearing calm on the surface, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. The truckers scattered around the room shared the same unspoken resolve. They were ready if things turned ugly. Blade leaned over to Tank and whispered, his voice low but forceful. "That old man's got too much confidence. Let's see how tough he really is." Tank nodded, cracking his knuckles. "Say the word, boss," he replied with a wink. Blade smirked and looked around the room. His gaze landed on Pete, who was nervously cleaning the counter. "Start with him," Blade whispered, jerking his head in Pete's direction. Tank grinned and stood up from his seat at the counter. The booth and lumbering toward the counter, Pete froze as Tank approached. The sheer size of the man was enough to intimidate him. "You run this place?" Tank asked, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Pete hesitated, glancing toward Ray. "I manage it, yeah," he said cautiously. Tank leaned forward, his massive frame towering over the smaller man. "Then I guess you're responsible for what happens here, huh?" he asked. Pete swallowed hard, his hands gripping the rag he'd been using to wipe the counter. "What do you want?" he replied. Tank let out a little chuckle, reaching for a glass from the counter. "Just testing the durability of your equipment," he said with a wink. He then slammed the glass onto the floor, shattering it into pieces. The loud crash made everyone in the diner flinch, and Pete's face turned pale. Before he could respond, Ree stood up and moved with purpose, crossing the room in a few strides until he was standing between Pete and Tank. The room fell silent, and Ree said, "That's enough." His voice was steady but commanding, and Tank turned to face him. His lips curled into a playful sneer. "Oh, you again? You really like sticking your nose where it doesn't belong, don't you?" Didn't waver. "You're done here. Pay for the damages and leave." Tank laughed, the sound echoing through the room. "Oh, what are you going to do, stop me?" Ray took a step closer. His eyes locked on Tank's. "I don't need to stop you," he said. "Look around." Tank hesitated, glancing around the room. The other truckers had risen to their feet again, forming a silent wall of solidarity. Their expressions showed they were ready to back Ray if it came to that. Blade was still seated at the booth, watching the scene unfold with a stern look on his face. He slammed his fist on the table, drawing everyone's attention. "Enough of this," he said, standing up. "We're not here to play games." He strode over to where Ray and Tank stood, his presence amplifying the tension. Blade pointed a finger at Ray, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you?" he said. "Because these guys are standing behind you." Ree met his glare with unshakable calm. "It's not about being a hero, it's about doing what's right." Blade scoffed, shaking his head. "You've got no idea who you're dealing with." Ree's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Neither do you," he said with a gentle tease. For a moment, it seemed like Blade might back down. But then his smirk returned, and he turned to his crew. "Let's teach these folks a lesson," he said with a wink. He set his voice loud enough to carry through the diner. The Iron Serpent sprang into action, knocking over chairs and tables as they moved to confront the truckers. The patrons gasped and Lisa ducked behind the counter, her heart pounding. Pete reached for the phone to call the police, but Ree stopped him with a raised hand. "Not yet," Ree said quietly. "We've got this." Blade lunged toward Ray, throwing a punch aimed at his face, but Ray was quicker. He sidestepped the blow and grabbed Blade. S's arm twisted behind his back with practiced precision. Blade let out a grunt of pain as Ray forced him to the ground. Tank rushed forward to help, but Mac intercepted him, blocking his path. Jimmy and another trucker, a burly man named Frank, stepped in to handle the rest of the gang. The room erupted into chaos as the truckers and bikers clashed. Despite their rough demeanor, the bikers were no match for the seasoned truckers, many of whom had spent years honing their skills. Their strength and resilience on the road were admirable. Ray held Blade in a firm grip. His voice was calm but firm as he addressed the gang. "This stops now," he said. "You've got two choices. Leave peacefully or find out what happens when you push people too far." Blade struggled against Ray's hold, but it was clear he was outmatched. The other bikers, seeing their leader subdued and their numbers overwhelmed, began to falter. Tank, who had been trading blows with Mac, raised his hands in surrender. All right, he said. Tank shouted, "We're done." Ray released Blade, who scrambled to his feet, clutching his arm. He glared at Ree, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. "You'll regret this," Blade spat. His voice was shaking, but Ray didn't flinch. "Maybe," he replied, "but you'll regret it more if you don't leave now." Blade hesitated, looking around at his crew. One by one, they nodded, signaling their agreement to retreat. The gang began backing toward the door, their bravado replaced by a simmering resentment. As they reached the exit, Blade turned back to Ree. His eyes were filled with fury. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and threatening. Ree met his gaze without a hint of fear. "Yes, it is," the bikers replied, storming out. Their motorcycles roared to life as they sped away. Inside the diner, things were a bit chaotic, but the atmosphere was lighter. The truckers exchanged relieved glances, and Lisa emerged from behind the counter. Her face was pale, but she was grateful. Pete let out a long breath, shaking his head. "Ray, I don't know how you do it," Ree said with a little shrug. "Just another day, I suppose." The truckers chuckled, and the tension began to dissipate. But even as the immediate danger passed, Ray couldn't shake the feeling that Blad's parting words weren't just empty threats. The air outside the truck stop was thick with the lingering echoes of roaring engines as the iron serpents disappeared into the distance. Inside, the patrons began to pick up the pieces. Chairs were being set upright, and the broken plates and glasses were carefully gathered up, and the camaraderie that had kept them united during the chaos now extended into the cleanup effort. Ray quietly helped Pete gather the shattered remains of the glass tank that had smashed earlier. Lisa approached Ree, clutching a broom tightly, her voice still shaky. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. Ree looked up and gave her a reassuring smile. "You don't have to," he said. "Just take care of yourself." Lisa hesitated before asking, "Do you think they'll come back?" "I think they'll come back, don't you?" Max said with a reassuring smile. "People like them don't like losing, but if they do come back, we'll be ready. We've got this." His hands were still a little dusty from helping to right a table, but he didn't mind. If they showed their faces again, they'd be ready to handle it together. The truckers nodded in agreement, their collective presence a quiet but powerful reminder that unity was their greatest strength. Pete, who had been on edge the entire time, finally relaxed enough to offer Ray a smile. "I can't say this is the kind of excitement I was expecting," he said with a wry grin. "We needed you there, Ray. You were just doing what anyone else would have done." Mac interjected, saying that most folks would have turned a blind eye. Jimmy chimed in from his spot near the counter, but he didn't say anything about Ray. After all, he's got that marine instinct, which sees trouble and steps in before anyone else. Ree didn't respond to the praise, but he didn't need to. He just focused on the task at hand, sweeping up the remaining glass with Lisa's help. Meanwhile, the others continued cleaning up. The truckers shifted to cautious optimism, sharing stories of past scrapes, and even Pete managing a few jokes to ease the tension in the air. But Ree couldn't ignore that nagging feeling in the back of his mind. Blad's parting words kept replaying in his head, a subtle warning that the biker leader wasn't finished. Years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now they were telling him to stay on guard as night fell. The truck stop grew quieter, most of the truckers having gone back to their rigs. The truckers had gone back to their rigs, getting ready for the next part of their journey. Lisa and Sarah were working together in the kitchen, making meals for the few customers who were still there. Pete was leaning against the counter, looking as cheerful as ever, as the adrenaline wore off. Ree stayed behind for longer than usual, sitting at the counter and drinking a fresh cup of coffee. Jimmy came over and sat on the stool next to him. "Do you think those guys will come back?" he asked. Ree took a sip of coffee before answering. He took a sip of his coffee before answering. "I'd bet on it." Jimmy nodded grimly. "They don't look like the type to let things go." Ree agreed, "But they'll think twice before trying anything like that again." Jimmy chuckled softly. "That's the Marine in you and you talking." Ray glanced over at him. "You ever serve?" Jimmy shook his head. "Nope. But my dad always told me to stand up for what's right, no matter what." Ray smiled faintly. "Smart man." "Jimmy." He leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You know, if they do come back, they won't just be looking to scare us. They'll want payback." Ray nodded. "That's why we need to be ready." Meanwhile, a few miles down the road, the Iron Serpents had pulled over at a rest area. The gang was visibly agitated, their earlier bravado now mixed with frustration and anger. Blade paced back and forth, his fists clenched as he replayed the events of the afternoon in his mind. Blade was still fuming. He thought back to that afternoon. We'd let that old man get the better of us. He was really cross. Tank was leaning against his bike and grunted in agreement. They were right. We should have handled it differently. We should have shown them who was boss. Blade stopped pacing and turned to his crew. "We're not letting this go. We're not letting that truck stop. We're not letting that old man get the better of us. We're going to show them who's boss." Razor was the wiry member of the group, raised an eyebrow. "You sure about this, boss? Those truckers were no joke." Blade shot him a sharp glare. "You scared Razor?" Razor quickly shook his head no. "Just thinking. We might want to be smart about it." Blade smirked. "Smart's exactly what we're going to be. We'll come back when they least expect it. And this time we won't hold back." The gang murmured their agreement, though a few of them exchanged uneasy glances. It was clear that they were obsessed with revenge, and it was dragging them into dangerous territory. Still, none of them dared to challenge him outright back at the truck stop. Ray finally decided to head out for the night. He said his goodbyes to Pete, Lisa, and the remaining truckers, promising to check in the next day. As he walked to his rig, he couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was brewing. He paused at the edge of the parking lot, scanning the horizon. The night was quiet, but Ree knew. It's always better to trust your instincts. The next morning, the truck stop was back to business as usual. The regulars trickled in, greeting each other with friendly nods and smiles. Lisa was back at the counter, her usual cheer returning after a good night's rest. Pete was working the register, cracking jokes with Sarah about the excitement from the day before. But Ray arrived earlier than usual, parking his rig in a spot that gave him a clear view of the entire lot. He wasn't taking any chances. The others were planning to return, so he wanted to be ready. Jimmy noticed Ray's arrival and joined him at the counter. "Can't sleep either, huh?" he said, half joking. "I wish I could," Jimmy replied. "I'm so tired." "Me too," Ray said, shaking his head. "Something tells me we haven't seen the last of them." Jimmy sighed. "Guess we better be ready then." "We will," Ray nodded. The truck stop patrons had no idea that the Iron Serpents were already making their way back. Their motorcycles were rumbling like an approaching storm. Blade's plan was simple. Blade was hoping to catch them off guard and remind everyone who was in charge. But what he didn't realize was that this community of truckers was stronger than he could have ever imagined. The morning air was crisp as the patrons at Horizon Truck Stop went about their routines. Ray was ever watchful, staying near the counter and keeping an eye on the parking lot. Lisa refilled his coffee, offering a small smile. She asked quietly, "You really think they'll come back?" Ray took a sip before answering, "People like them will. We can't just walk away, but this time we'll be ready." Lisa nodded, though her hands trembled slightly as she returned to the kitchen. The weight of the previous day's events still lingered, but there was an unspoken sense of resolve among the truckers. They had seen what the Iron Serpents were capable of, and none of them wanted a repeat of that chaos. Jimmy joined Ray at the counter carrying a plate of eggs and toast. "So, what's the plan if they show up again?" he asked, his tone casual but with a hint of concern. Ray sat down, took a sip of coffee and met Jimmy's gaze. "Stay calm. We stand together and we make it clear that they are not welcome." Jimmy nodded, though a flicker of doubt crossed his face. "I just hope they don't push it too far," he said. Before Ray could respond, the distant rumble of motorcycle engines broke the morning stillness. Heads turned, and a hush fell over the diner as the sound grew louder. Pete, who had been joking with Sarah stopped laughing suddenly, and Lisa peeked out from the kitchen, her expression showing she was worried. "They're back," Mac muttered from his seat near the window. His voice was calm, but his hands clenched into fists. Ree stood up, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. He looked at Jimmy and the others and said, "Let's see what they're planning." The iron serpents rolled into the parking lot, their bikes lined up in a menacing formation. The Blade was at the front, and his leather jacket glinted in the morning light. He dismounted in the sunlight, grinning from ear to ear. His crew followed suit, moving with purpose and a swagger that was more pronounced than before. Inside the truck stop, the atmosphere was charged with tension. The patrons watched as the bikers approached, their expressions a mix of anger and apprehension. Lisa gripped the counter tightly, her knuckles white. Pete glanced at Ree, silently seeking reassurance. Ray gave a small nod, his calm demeanor steadying those around him. He looked at Lisa and said quietly, "Just remember, we're stronger together." Blade opened the door with a loud creak, his smile growing wider as he took in the room. Well, he drawled, "Looks like we're back by popular demand." No one responded, and the silence was heavy. The trucker collective resolve was evident in their stony expressions. Blade's grin faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. He stepped further into the diner, his boots clunking against the tiled floor. "Now I know we got off on the wrong foot yesterday," Blade said, his tone warm and friendly. Ray stepped forward, his calm but commanding presence drawing the biker's attention. "You've said enough. Turn around and leave." But Blade wasn't going to let this go. He stepped closer to Ray, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You really think you can tell us what to do?" he asked. Ray's response was calm but firm. "I don't need to. You already know you don't belong here." Blade chuckled, though the sound lacked conviction. "You've got guts, old man. I'll give you that." Before Ray could respond, Tank stepped forward. His massive frame loomed over the room. "We came here to settle things," he said, his voice a low rumble. The tension in the room reached a breaking point, and the truckers seated at various tables began to rise. Mac, Jimmy, and Frank positioned themselves near Ray, their expressions unyielding. Pete retreated to the counter, his hand hovering near the phone, ready to call for help if things escalated. Blade noticed the shift and let out a playful laugh. "What's this?" "A little army of truckers," he teased. "Think you can take us on, Ray?" he asked, his voice calm and measured. "You don't have to answer now," Blade continued, his tone gentle and reassuring. "Just take a moment to consider your options. You have two choices, walk away or regret staying." Blade's smile faded as he noticed the look on Ray's face. It was a look of steel, and it made Blade feel like he was walking on thin ice. "You've got a lot of nerve, Ray," Blade said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You know, you've got a lot to lose." Ray took a step closer, his voice steady and calm. "You've got a lot to lose for a moment," he repeated, his eyes meeting Blade's. "But you know what? I've got a lot to lose too." The room was still, and the tension crackled like electricity. Blade glanced around, taking in the unwavering stares of the truckers. He felt like he was in a spotlight, and he was acutely aware of how the truckers' faces showed they were willing to give in, but he was proud and wouldn't back down easily. Finally, he raised his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. All right, we'll play nice." The truckers didn't relax their stance, but the bikers backed away slightly. Blade's eyes flicked toward Ree, and his expression showed a mix of anger and grudging respect. "Don't think this is over," he said, his tone dark and warning them to be back. Ray didn't flinch. "We'll be here." The bikers lingered for a moment longer, their defiance hanging in the air. Then, one by one, they turned and left, their heavy boots echoing through the diner as the door swung shut behind them. The truckers exchanged glances, feeling relieved. They thought they'd actually stay away this time. Jimmy asked, his voice low. Ray shook. He shook his head no, but next time they'll learn just how strong this community really is. The iron serpents roared. They rode out of the car park, their bikes kicking up gravel as they disappeared down the highway. Inside the diner, the tension slowly began to ease. The truckers returned to their seats, but their eyes kept darting towards the door, wary of what might happen next. Lisa sat down, a fresh pot of coffee in her hands, shaking hands, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Pete approached Ray cautiously, wiping his hands on a rag. "Do you think they're gone for good this time?" he asked, his voice betraying his nerves. Ray shook his head. "I don't think so. Men like that don't know when to quit." Pete sighed and leaned against the counter. "I don't know how you stay so calm. If it were up to me, I'd have called the cops by now." Ree offered a faint smile. "Sometimes it's better to handle things yourself. Cops might escalate the situation, and we don't need that." Jimmy chimed in from the booth. I'd say so. Besides, I don't think those guys are looking for anything. They want to prove something. Make sure we remember them. Mac, who had been quietly sipping his coffee, finally spoke up. They want to scare us, but they don't understand truckers look out for each other, always have, always will. His words seemed to resonate with everyone in the room. Heads nodded in agreement, and the uneasy silence began to dissipate. Even Lisa managed a small smile as she refilled Max's cup. Still, Ray couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the back. Blade's parting words had been more than just a threat to an idol. They carried a promise of something darker, and Ray knew better than to underestimate a man like that. He glanced out the window, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. Meanwhile, several miles down the road, the Iron Serpents had pulled into an abandoned lot. Their bikes formed a semicircle as they gathered to discuss their next move. Blade stood in the center, pacing back and forth as his crew watched him. With a mix of frustration and unease, "We didn't come this far to be humiliated by a bunch of truckers." Blade grumbled, his fists clenched at his sides, the tank leaning against his bike with his arms crossed. "So what's the plan, boss? We can't just roll back in there without a strategy." Blade stopped pacing and turned to face his crew. "We don't need a strategy. We need to remind them who we are. We'll go back tonight and show them." "Why?" "Nobody messes with the Iron Serpents." Razor, the wiry and often skeptical member of the group, raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that? Those guys didn't look like they were going to back down. And that old man, he's tougher than he looks." Blade sneered. "He's just an old man trying to act tough. We'll put him in his place." The rest of the gang murmured their agreement, though some of them exchanged uneasy glances. It was clear. Not everyone was fully on board with Blade's obsession, but none of them dared to challenge him outright back at the truck stop. Ree and the others began preparing for the possibility of another confrontation. Ma suggested locking the doors, but Pete shook his head. "We've never locked up before, and we're not starting now. This place is open to everyone, well, almost everyone." Jimmy smirked. "Almost." He echoed. Ree, however, wasn't taking any chances. He quietly organized the truckers, making sure everyone knew what to do if the Iron Serpents returned. If the Iron Serpents returned, we just wanted to make sure we didn't do anything to upset them. We didn't want to be unkind, but we also didn't want to be intimidated. Mac nodded. "What about Lisa and Sarah? They shouldn't be out here if things go south." Pete agreed. "I'll keep them in the back if it comes to that." The plan was simple but effective. The truckers would hold the line, and the staff would stay out of harm's way. Ray made it clear that violence was a last resort. But everyone knew the Iron Serpents wouldn't come back for a friendly chat. As the day wore on, the truck stop returned to a semblance of normality. Regular customers filtered in and out, oblivious to the tension that had gripped the place just hours earlier. Ray stayed vigilant, his eyes constantly scanning the parking lot. The other truckers followed his lead, their quiet resolve a testament to the strength of their community. By the time the sun began to set, the atmosphere in the diner had Pete locked eyes with Ree as he refilled a salt shaker. "You think they'll come back tonight?" Ray nodded. "If they're coming back, it'll be after dark." Lisa overheard and froze mid-step. Her face was pale. Sarah put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry, sweetheart," she said gently. "We've got Ree and the others. Nothing's going to happen to us." Lisa nodded, though her unease was evident. She glanced out the window. The darkening sky only added to his anxiety. Pete let out a little sigh. "You're not the only one feeling this way, my friend." As night fell, the truckers began to settle into their positions. Ray remained by the counter, his posture relaxed but his senses sharp. Jimmy and Ma sat at a nearby table chatting casually, but ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. Pete kept a close eye on the door. His usual jovial demeanor was replaced with quiet determination. Outside, the distant rumble of motorcycles could be heard. At last, the sound broke the silence. It was faint at first, but it grew louder with each passing second. The truckers exchanged knowing glances. Their calm expressions masked the tension that gripped the room. "They're here," Max said quietly. Ray stood up. His movements were deliberate. "Stay calm," he said. "We'll handle this." The Iron Serpents pulled into the parking lot. Their bikes formed a menacing line in front of the truck stop. Blade dismounted first. His smirk was more pronounced than ever. Tank and the others followed him. Swagger, a clear attempt to intimidate inside the truckers, rose to their feet one by one. Their unity was in silent but powerful statement. He looked at the truckers, who stood silently, their faces unreadable. His gaze eventually landed on Ree, who stood calmly at the counter, unmoving, still playing the hero. Old Man Blade said, his voice laced with mockery. I thought you'd have learned your lesson by now. Ray didn't respond immediately. He simply met Blade's gaze with quiet confidence. Finally, he said, You've gotten no business here. Turn around and leave while you still can. Blade chuckled, shaking his head. Come on, don't you get it? This isn't about business, it's about making sure you and your friends understand who's in charge. Tank stepped forward, his massive frame looming over the nearest truckers. Yeah, we're done playing nice. Jimmy took a step closer to Ray, his jaw set. You weren't playing nice to begin with. What are you going to do about it? Max's voice cut through the tension. Whatever it takes. The other truckers nodded in agreement, their unity evident. Front unwavering. Blade's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered his bravado, returning in full force. He turned to Ray, his tone turning colder. You think you can scare us with your little trucker army? We've taken down bigger groups than this. Ray stepped forward, his calm demeanor never wavering. This isn't about scaring you. It's about stopping you. Blade scoffed. Stopping us? You think you're a big shot vigilante now. His head was just a man who wouldn't stand by and let bullies like you run wild. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of Ray's words hanging in the air. The truckers remained steady, their resolve unshaken. Blade, however, was not one to back down easily. He glanced at his crew and nodded. The iron serpents spread out, their movements deliberate. Tank knocked over a chair as he moved toward the center of the room, while Razor began rifling through. There was a rack of menus near the door. Another biker, a wiry man nicknamed Ghost, tapped his fingers on the counter. His expression was bored but watchful. Pete, who had been quietly observing from behind the counter, tightened his grip on the phone. Ray noticed the movement and gave him a subtle shake of his head. Not yet, he said softly. Lisa and Sarah watched from the kitchen doorway. Their faces were pale but determined. Sarah placed a protective arm around Lisa's shoulders. She whispered words of reassurance. It'll be okay, she said. Don't worry, I'm sure Ray will be just fine, she said, her voice soft and reassuring. Ray, meanwhile, was getting closer to Ray, his smirk returning. You know, you've got guts, he said, his voice full of admiration. I'll give you that, but guts only get you so far. Ray remained still, his calm presence unwavering. Threats only get you so far, he said, his voice calm and steady. Blade's smile faded, replaced by a flash of irritation. You really don't know when to quit, do you? He said, his voice full of frustration. Ray took a small step forward, closing the distance between them. Neither do you, he said, his voice soft but firm. The tension in the room was palpable. Blade was getting pretty wound up. He clenched his fists and looked like he was about to explode. The other iron serpents exchanged glances, sensing that their leader was starting to crack under the pressure. Tank, always eager to get things moving, stepped towards Mac. He had a challenging look on his face. Mac didn't back down. He just wondered when he'd realize he was out of his league. Tank let out a low chuckle. His fists tightened. Jimmy moved to stand beside Mac, his stance firm. If you're looking for a fight, you're not going to like how it ends, he warned. Blade turned his attention to the growing standoff, his irritation boiling over. We didn't come here to listen to your speeches. Ray's voice was calm but firm. So why are you here to make fools of yourselves again? Ray's expression darkened. We're here to settle the score and we're not leaving until we do. He took another step forward, his voice steady. You already lost. You just haven't figured it out yet. Blade sneered. His fists tightened. Oh, I've figured it out and I'm about to show you just how wrong you are. The iron serpents began to close in. Their movements were deliberate. The truckers stood there, their unity unshaken. Pete's hand hovered. Over the phone, his instincts were telling him to call for help, but Ray's calm resolve kept him rooted in place. The room felt like it was about to explode. Blade's frustration turned to anger, and he raised his fist, ready to strike. But before he could make his move, Ray spoke again, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. This is your last chance, he said. Walk away now and no one gets hurt. Blade froze, his fist still raised for a moment, like he might listen, but then he lowered his hand, his smirk returning. You're lucky I'm feeling generous, he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. He turned to his crew and nodded toward the door, letting them go. The iron serpents hesitated, but ultimately followed Blade's lead. Their earlier bravado giving way to quiet frustration. One by one they filed out of the diner, their footsteps heavy with unspoken resentment. Blade paused at the door, glancing back at Ray. I think you've won, he said, his voice low but with a hint of triumph. This isn't over, Ray replied, his tone calm and measured. Blade didn't reply. He pushed the door open and stepped outside, his crew close behind. The sound of their motorcycles echoed through the parking lot as they sped away, leaving the truck stop with an intense silence. Inside, the truckers exchanged glances, and Mac let out a slow breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "I think they're gone," he said. "I think this time is really over, Ray. I'm sure we'll be ready next time." The sound of the Iron Serpent's motorcycles faded into the distance, leaving the truck stop in a heavy silence. The tension in the room lingered, though the immediate threat had passed. Mac leaned against the counter, his eyes narrowing as he watched Ray take a seat again. "I don't think they're done, do you?" Mac asked, his voice low. Ray shook his head no. "They're not the kind of man who. Let's not dwell on it. He's testing us, seeing how far we're willing to stand our ground." Jimmy sat down beside Ray, his jaw tight. "If they come back, it won't be to talk. They'll want to make a statement." Pete, standing behind the counter, wiped his hands nervously on a towel. "I can't run this place with them showing up all the time, scaring off customers. Maybe we should get the police involved." Ray looked at Pete and shook his head gently. "Not yet, the police. We might end up doing things we don't want to do right now. We're doing our best to handle it, but it's not easy." Lisa approached carefully, holding a tray of drinks. Her hands were still shaking a little, but she managed a small smile. "Do you really think they'll come back?" she asked quietly. Ray gave her a reassuring nod. "If they do, we'll deal with it. You don't need to worry about them," he said kindly. Lisa tried to smile, though the fear in her eyes was evident. Sarah stepped in, placing a comforting hand on Lisa's shoulder. "It's going to be okay," she said. Gently placing a hand on Lisa's shoulder, Sarah said, "You let Ray and the boys take care of this, don't worry." Lisa nodded and returned to the kitchen, but she cast one last glance at Ray before disappearing through the door. The truckers exchanged quiet looks, their silent agreement to stand together strengthening with each passing moment. Outside, the Iron Serpents regrouped a few miles down the road, parked their bikes in a clearing off the highway and waited. Tanks slammed his helmet onto the ground, his face twisted with anger. "That old man and those truckers are making us look weak," he growled. "We should have dealt with them right there." Blade turned to face him, his jaw clenched. "We're not finished. This isn't over." Razor, always the cautious one, spoke up. "We're pushing it too far. Blade, those guys aren't scared of us. If we keep this up, it's only going to get worse." Blade glared at Razor, his eyes narrowing. "You worry about a bunch of truckers." "Razor, since when did the Iron Serpents back down from a fight?" Razor held Blade's gaze for a moment before looking away. "I'm just saying, maybe we should think this through." Blade sneered. "I've already thought it through. We're going back tonight, and this time we're making sure they remember who we are." The rest of the gang murmured their agreement, though some of them exchanged. Blade was so focused on revenge that even his most loyal followers were feeling uneasy. They didn't want to voice their concerns back at the truck stop, so they stayed silent. Ree and the others began preparing for the night ahead. The mood was tense but focused as the truckers devised a plan to handle the Iron Serpents if they returned. Max suggested reinforcing the diner entrances, but Pete shook his head. "This place has been open to everyone for years," he said. "We're not locking the doors." Jimmy nodded. "Not locking the doors now," he said. "It's not about locking them out. It's about standing our ground. If they see we're not afraid, they'll think twice before pulling anything." Ray leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. "They're coming back, that much is certain," he said. "But we've got the advantage. We're united and we've got each other's backs. That's something they don't have." Mac glanced at the door, his brow furrowed. "If it comes to a fight," he said. "If it comes to a fight," Ree's voice was steady. "We stand firm. No one acts unless it's absolutely necessary. Violence is their game, not ours." The truckers nodded. They knew the risks, but their loyalty to each other and to the truck stop outweighed their fear. Lisa and Sarah stayed in the kitchen, helping to prepare food for the truckers and staff. This was a way to keep busy and calm their nerves. As night fell, the tension in the diner grew thicker. The truckers took their positions, keeping a close watch on the parking lot. Ray stayed near the counter, his calm presence a source of reassurance for the others. Pete checked the clock repeatedly, uttering under his breath about how quiet the night was. Jimmy broke the silence. "It's almost too quiet," he said. Ray glanced out the window, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness. "They're out there waiting," he said. And they were the Iron Serpents. They parked their bikes just outside the range of the truck stop's lights. Their figures were barely visible in the darkness. The Shadow's Blade was at the front, looking calm and collected. He turned to the crew and said, "It's time to go in and show them who's boss. Tank cracked his knuckles, eager for action. Razor was a little hesitant at first, but he followed along with the rest of the gang as they moved towards the diner. Their footsteps were heavy, but they were also filled with purpose. Inside, Ray straightened his gaze and fixed it on the door. He said quietly, "The truckers are here." Max stood near the door, his arms crossed. Jimmy stood beside him. Moved to stand beside Ray, his jaw set. Pete retreated to the kitchen where Lisa and Sarah waited anxiously. The door creaked open and Blade stepped inside. His crew close behind, he didn't speak immediately. Instead, he looked around the room, taking in his surroundings before landing on Ree. "You didn't think we'd stay away, did you?" Blade said, his voice full of a playful tease. Ree met his gaze without flinching. "I was counting on it," Blade chuckled, his eyes twinkling with a hint of mischief. He took a step closer to Ree. "You've got guts, old man. I'll give you that, but guts only get you so far." Ray didn't respond. He didn't need to. The truckers stood behind him, their silent presence a clear message that they weren't going anywhere. Blade's smirk faltered for a moment, but his frustration quickly overtook him. He turned to his crew, nodding toward the truckers. "Let's see how tough they really are," he said, his voice full of challenge. The serpents began to fan out across the diner, their boots thudding heavily against the floor and their intimidating presence filling the room. Tank moved to the counter, looming over Pete, who had nervously stepped back from the register. Razor was near the jukebox, tapping it idly as if he owned the place. The other bikers stood in scattered positions, eyeing the truckers like predators circling their prey. Ray didn't flinch. He stood his ground at the center of the room, his calm gaze locked on Blade. In the middle of the room, his calm gaze locked on Blade. The truckers stayed put, their quiet confidence still intact. Mac crossed his arms and leaned against the wall, his eyes never leaving Tank. Jimmy stood by the counter, ready to step in if necessary. Blade smiled, gesturing around the room. "A little trucker army, huh? Think you can stand together and stop us?" Ree's voice was steady and kind. "It's already stopped you twice. I suggest you leave before you embarrass yourself." The truckers chuckled softly at Ray's words, their subtle defiance striking a nerve with Blade. His smirk twisted into a scowl as he took a step closer to Ree. "You've got a big mouth for an old man," Blade growled, "but you're not as tough as you think." Ray remained unfazed. "You're not as smart as you think." Tank was getting a little impatient and let out a little growl. He slammed his fist on the counter, which made Pete jump a bit. "Talk," Tank bellowed. "We're here to settle this." Jimmy stepped forward, his jaw tight. "If you want to fight, you're going to get more than you bargained for." Tank sneered, big words. "Let's see if you can back them up." Ray raised a hand, his calm but commanding presence silencing the room. "No one's fighting," he said. His voice carried the weight of authority, and even the bikers listened. He paused for a moment, Blade narrowed his eyes, studying Ree. "Do you think you're in charge here?" he asked, gesturing to his crew. "Let's show him how wrong he is," he said with a wink. Tank grabbed a chair and flung it across the room. The crash of wood splintering against the floor was deafening, and Lisa let out a startled gasp from the kitchen doorway. Pete moved to step forward, but Max stopped him with a firm hand on his shoulder. Razor moved toward the magazine rack, tossing the neatly arranged books and papers onto the floor. The other bikers joined in, appending tables and knocking over chairs. The destruction was calculated and meant to provoke a reaction. Ree watched silently, his expression unreadable. When Blade stepped closer, Ray's voice cut through the chaos. "You've made your point, now leave," he said, laughing coldly. "We're just getting started," Jimmy replied, his frustration evident. "We're not letting them trash this place," he added firmly. He muttered. Ray placed a hand on Jimmy's shoulder, stopping him. "Not yet." Ree said quietly, "Let them dig their own grave." Blade seemed to sense the restraint in Ray's words, and it only fueled his arrogance. He stepped right up to Ray, his smirk returning. "What's the matter, hero? Afraid to get your hands dirty?" Ree's voice was calm but firm. "I'm not afraid of anything, but I'm smart enough to know when to act." Blade chuckled, shaking his head. You're just stalling, Ray. I know you don't have what it takes to stop us." Ray's lips curved into a faint smile. "You'd be surprised." The iron serpents continued their rampage, but the truckers didn't waver. They stood there, grounding their quiet unity, which unnerved the bike more than they cared to admit. Outnumbered, and the truckers were really sticking to their guns. The longer the standoff went on, the more it seemed like the bikers were losing control of the situation. Finally, Blade gave a little shrug and said, "Let's go." His voice was full of disdain. "These guys aren't worth it." The bikers exchanged glances, but they followed Blade's lead anyway. They began to back away, their earlier bravado fading. Tank knocked over one last chair as he left. He passed, earning a sharp glare from Mac. Blade stopped at the door, turning back to face Ree. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and threatening. Ree met his gaze without flinching. "It is if you want it to be," Blade replied, his expression darkening. He didn't reply, though. Instead, he pushed the door open and stepped outside. His crew followed closely behind, their motorcycles roaring as they sped away, leaving the truck stop in disarray. Inside, the truckers began picking up the pieces. Chairs were set upright and magazines were gathered from the floor. Lisa and Sarah emerged from the kitchen, their expressions a mix of relief and exhaustion. Pete approached Ree, shaking his head. "I don't know how you do it," he said. "If they come back again, they won't." Ray interrupted, his voice firm. "Not after tonight." Mac chuckled as he picked up a broken chair. "You've got more faith in them than I do." Ray didn't respond. Instead, he looked out the window. His sharp eyes scanned the dark highway, and something told him this wasn't the last he'd see of Blade and the Iron Serpents. But for now, the truck stop was safe, and that was all that mattered. The truck stop settled into an uneasy calm after the Iron Serpent's latest departure. The truckers continued to clean up the damage, their movements deliberate but silent. Pete swept shards of broken plates into a dustpan, shaking his head. "I've seen my share of rowdy customers," he muttered. "They're not customers, they're vandals," Jimmy said, dropping a pile of magazines back onto the rack inside. "They'll keep coming back until we make it clear this isn't their playground." Lisa, standing near the counter, glanced nervously at Ree. "Do you really think they'll stay away this time?" Ree paused, his eyes fixed on the window, as though expecting to see the biker's headlights reappear at any moment. "No," he said. "Oh, bless him, he's just not the kind of person to let things go. He'll be back, that's for sure. The question is, when?" Sarah gave Lisa a little pat on the shoulder, her tone firm but reassuring. "Let them come, sweetheart," she said. "They'll find out what this place is made of." Lisa nodded, but her eyes told a different story. Pete sat down on his broom and approached Ree. "We can't keep going like this," he said. "Next time someone could get hurt." Ray turned to Pete, his expression calm but, with a firm resolve, "We'll handle it as long as we stick together. They don't stand a chance." Mac walked over, hands on his hips. "You really think that gang's going to back down after all this?" Blad's got too much pride to just walk away. Ray nodded. "That's what makes him dangerous, but it's also his weakness." Jimmy raised an eyebrow. "Weakness, pride blinds him." Ree explained that he's so focused on proving he's in control that he doesn't see the bigger picture, bless him. It'll be his downfall. The truckers exchanged glances, their confidence bolstered by Ray's steady presence. But even as they resumed their cleanup, the tension in the room remained. Everyone knew the Iron Serpents weren't finished, and the next encounter would likely be worse. Meanwhile, Blade and his crew had gathered at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The atmosphere was tense. The biker's earlier bravado had given way to a simmering frustration. Tank leaned against his bike, looking frustrated. "This is getting old," he grumbled. "We show up and those truckers act like they own the place. It's humiliating." Blade sat on a crate with his arms crossed, glaring at Tank. "I think I don't know that we've been embarrassed twice because they've got numbers, but this isn't over. And his crew are tougher than they look." Blade's glare shifted to Razor. His voice was gentle, yet firm. "You're not scared of a bunch of truckers, are you, Razor?" Razor hesitated, then shook his head no. "We might want to think this through. They're not going to roll over, and the more we push, the more they dig in." Blade stood abruptly. His expression was dark. "I'm not backing down. This is about respect. We walk away now, and no one will take us seriously again." Ghost, the quietest member of the gang, finally spoke up. "So, what's the plan? You keep saying we're not done, but we can't just keep barging in there." Blade smiled, though it lacked its usual confidence. "We'll catch them off guard, go in late after the place is empty, and make sure they know we can hit them anytime, anywhere." Pete and Lisa were working hard to straighten the counter area, while Mac and Jimmy were moving the last of the overturned chairs back into place. Ree was standing near the window, his eyes scanning the parking lot. He could feel the tension building, like the calm before a storm. Jimmy joined him, leaning against the wall. "Do you think they'll try something again tonight?" Ray asked. "I really think so," Jimmy replied. "They're too angry to wait." Mac overheard and walked over. "Then we'd better be ready," Ray said. "Group," his voice calm but firm. "If they come back, we don't engage unless we have to. They want us to react, they want chaos. We're not giving them that." Lisa, overhearing from behind the counter, spoke up hesitantly. What if they try to hurt someone? What do we do then? Ray looked at her, his expression softening. Then we do what we have to, but we don't go looking for a fight. The truckers nodded their quiet agreement. The clock on the wall showed it was getting late. Why don't you all get some rest? I'll keep an eye on things. Ray shook his head. No chance. If they're coming back, it'll be after dark. We're staying. Jimmy grinned. It wouldn't feel right leaving you here to handle it alone. Pete sighed. He didn't argue. He knew the truckers were right. Leaving now would only make them vulnerable. Instead, he headed to the kitchen to check on Lisa and Sarah, who were cleaning up for the night. As the hours ticked by, the truck stop grew quieter. The regulars had left, and the parking lot was nearly empty, save for the truckers who had decided to stay. Ray remained by the window, his watchful gaze never wavering. Mac and Jimmy sat at a nearby table, chatting quietly to pass the time. The faint sound of motorcycle engines reached Ray's ears. Distant but growing louder, he straightened his eyes and narrowed his gaze. I think they're here, he said quietly. The truckers immediately sprang into action, their earlier exhaustion replaced with a steely resolve. Mac moved to the door, his broad shoulders blocking the entrance. Jimmy grabbed a nearby chair, turning it around to face the door as he sat down, his arms resting casually on the backrest. Pete emerged from the kitchen, his face pale. What do we do? He asked, his voice trembling slightly. Ray turned to him. Stay back, let us handle it, he said, his voice calm but firm. The sound of the motorcycles grew louder, and moments later they pulled into the car park. Their bikes were lined up in a row, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Blade got off his bike first. He looked angry and determined. The rest of the gang followed. They had earlier doubts, but now they were ready to prove themselves. Ree stepped forward. He was calm and collected. The truckers fell in behind him. They were all united, and it was a silent but powerful statement. Blade smiled as he approached the door. His movements were deliberate and confident. Well, well, Blade said with a smile as he pushed open the door. I see you're still standing. He strode into the diner, his boots echoing against the tile floor behind him. The iron serpents followed, their intimidating presence filling the room like a storm cloud. Tank cracked his knuckles and scanned the truckers, daring anyone to challenge him. Razor and Ghost hung back slightly, their expressions guarded but still projecting confidence. Blade stopped a few feet from the others. Ree, his smirk sharp and mocking. You really don't know when to quit, do you? Blade said, his voice dripping with false amusement. Here I thought truckers were supposed to be smart. Ray stood his ground, his expression calm and unwavering. Here I thought bikers knew how to pick their battles. The truckers behind Ray chuckled softly, their quiet unity only fueling Blade's growing frustration. He took another step forward, his smirk fading. You think this is funny, you think this. It's just a game, Ray's voice was calm. It's not a game, it's a warning. You don't belong here, my friend. Blade, you know what's best for you. Walk away while you still can. Blade's jaw tightened and his fists clenched at his sides. Tank moved closer, his massive frame looming over the nearest truckers. We've had enough of your little speeches, Tank growled. It's time to show you who's in charge. Standing near the door, standing with arms crossed and tilting his head, I could see that Tank was ready for a resolution. He tilted his head slightly. You sure about that? Looks to me like you're already losing. Tank sneered, taking another step forward, but Blade held up a hand, stopping him. Not yet. Outnumbered, Ray's faint smile was unshaken. You should count again, Blade suggested kindly. Glancing around, he noticed the truckers slowly moving into position. Jimmy and Mac had shifted slightly, their stances relaxed but deliberate. Frank, another trucker who had been quietly watching from the corner, stood up. His imposing frame added to the already formidable wall of solidarity. Even Pete, standing near the counter, seemed less nervous as he watched the unfolding standoff. Blade's smirk faltered for a moment, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He said, his voice low and dangerous, You want to play tough? Let's see how tough you really are. He turned to Tank and nodded. Start with him, he said, gesturing toward Mac. Tank grinned, stepping forward with a menacing glare. You've been running your mouth a lot, old man. Let's see if you can back it up. Mac didn't move. His calm demeanor remained intact as he met Tank's gaze without a hint of fear. You sure you want to do this, Mac? He asked, his tone almost casual. Tank didn't answer. He lunged forward, his massive fist swinging toward Mac's jaw. But Mac was quicker than he looked. He sidestepped the punch with surprising agility and delivered a sharp jab to Tank's ribs. Tank stumbled back, his face twisting in pain and surprise. The other truckers tensed, ready to jump in if needed, but Mac held up a hand, signaling them to stay back. "I've got it," he said calmly. "This," he said calmly. Tank growled and charged at Mac again, but this time Jimmy stepped in and grabbed Tank's arm, twisting it behind his back. Tank let out a grunt of pain, struggling against Jimmy's grip. But Jimmy was stronger and held firm. "That's enough," Ray said, his voice cutting through the commotion. "This ends now." Blade's smirk vanished completely, replaced by a scowl. "You think this is over?" "We're just getting started," he said. Ray took a step closer to Blade. His calm but commanding presence silenced the room. He took a step closer to Blade, his calm but commanding presence silencing the room. "It's up to you when this is over, but let me make one thing clear. If you come back here again, you'll be facing the law as well as us." Blade's eyes narrowed. The Iron Serpents exchanged certain glances, their earlier confidence crumbling under the pressure. Finally, Blade sneered and gestured to his crew, letting them go. He said, his voice laced with bitterness, "This place isn't worth it." The bikers hesitated, but ultimately followed Blade's lead, backing toward the door. Tank glared at Mac and Jimmy as he passed, his pride clearly bruised. Razor and Ghost avoided eye contact, their earlier swagger replaced with quiet unease. Blade paused at the door, turning back. "To Ree, one last time, you got lucky tonight, old man, but don't think this is the end." Ree's gaze was steady. "You're right, it's not the end, but it's your last warning." Blade didn't reply. He pushed the door open and stepped outside. His crew close behind. The roar of their motorcycles filled the air once again as they sped off into the night. Inside the diner, the truckers let out a collective sigh of relief. Mac adjusted his shirt, and he grinned. He thought they were pretty tough, but it turned out they weren't. Jimmy chuckled, rubbing his hands together. That was almost too easy. Pete leaned against the counter, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. He was just glad it was over. But Ray, he wasn't so sure. He watched the parking lot for a long moment, his sharp instincts telling him that this wasn't the last he'd see of Blade and his gang. But the truck stop was safe, and that was enough. The truck stop after the Iron Serpents left the truckers. Everyone fell into an uneasy calm. While they were relieved for the moment, they stayed on edge. Pete rubbed his temples, his exhaustion evident. He muttered, "I can't keep doing this." Reese still stood near the window and didn't turn around. He said, "They're going to come back. You know that, right?" Lisa and Sarah emerged from the kitchen. They looked pale but determined. Lisa approached Ree hesitantly. "Wring your hands, Mr. Carter. Do you think they're gone for good?" Ray turned to face her, his calm demeanor steadying her nerves. "I don't think Blade is the kind of man who walks away for good," he said. "But he's also not as strong as he pretends to be." Jimmy, sitting at the counter, chimed in. "Guys like Blade live off fear. He wants to scare us into backing down. But fear doesn't work when people stick together." Mac nodded, leaning back in his chair. "We've shown them we're not scared at all." Lisa managed a small smile, though the tension in her shoulders remained. "I really hope you're right." Sarah placed a comforting arm around her. "You let these boys handle the tough stuff. We're safe as long as they're here." Pete, however, wasn't as reassured. What happens when they stop playing games? Next time they might come back with something more dangerous than fists. Ray's expression darkened slightly, but his voice remained calm. "Steady, then we'll deal with it, whatever it takes." Outside, the Iron Serpents had regrouped at their makeshift base. Their earlier bravado had been replaced by frustration and anger. Blade paced in front of his crew, his fists clenched at his sides. "We're not done with them," he growled. "Not by a long shot." Tank still nursed his bruised pride and leaned against his bike. "What's the plan?" he asked. "Those truckers aren't backing down, and that old guy, he's no pushover. Man, he's got them all riled up." Blade stopped pacing and turned to face him. "We caught them off guard and hit them when they least expected it." Razor crossed his arms and looked skeptical. "You sure about this, Blade? They've got numbers in that old guy. He's no pushover." Blade's glare hardened. "Are you saying we can't handle them?" Razor hesitated before shaking his head. "No, I'm saying we need to think this through. If we go back there without a plan, we might end up in a tricky situation." Blade joked, "That's why we're going back tonight. And this time we're not stopping until they're happy for us to leave them to it." The rest of the gang exchanged glances, unsure what to make of it. But ultimately, they nodded in agreement. Blade's determination was inspiring, even if some of them were starting to feel a little tired of his obsession with revenge back at the truck stop. The truckers began preparing for the night. Ahead, Ray and Mac chatted about potential strategies in low voices to avoid alarming Pete or the others. "We need to be ready for anything," Ray said. If they come back, it won't just be for intimidation. They're looking for a fight. Mac nodded in agreement, but they don't know what we're capable of. Jimmy, who had been listening nearby, leaned in. What about the others? Lisa, Pete, Sarah? They can't be here if things go south. Ray's jaw tightened. Let's get them to the back and keep them out of harm's way, said Ray, as the truckers wrapped up their plan. Lisa approached, her expression a mix of hesitation and resolve. What can I do to help? She asked. Ray looked at her, his expression softening. You've already done so much, he replied. Stay in the back with Pete and Sarah. That's the best way to help. Lisa opened her mouth to argue, but ultimately nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. She disappeared into the kitchen, where Sarah was already gathered. As the sun set, the truck stop grew quieter. The regulars had left, and only a handful of rigs remained in the parking lot. Ray stayed near the window, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. The other truckers positioned themselves strategically around the diner, their quiet resolve a testament to their unity. Pete checked the locks on the doors, even though Ree had insisted they remain open just in case. When Ray raised an eyebrow, Jimmy chuckled softly. Guess we'll have to keep an eye out, huh? He said. Are you all feeling a bit nervous? Ray didn't respond. He was too busy listening to the faint sound of engines in the distance. At first, it was barely audible over the hum of the diner lights. But as the seconds passed, the sound grew louder. It was the unmistakable rumble of motorcycles approaching. They're here, Ray said quietly. Pete hurried to the kitchen where he joined Lisa and Sarah. His face was pale but determined. The Iron Serpents pulled into the parking lot, their bikes forming a menacing line. Blade dismounted first, his movements deliberate and confident. The rest of the gang followed suit, their earlier hesitation replaced with renewed determination. Blade pushed open the diner door, his smirk firmly in place. Well, he said, his voice carrying a mocking tone. Did you miss us? Ray stepped forward. A calm presence filled the room. Blade's smirk widened, but it was a little sad because he realized they weren't going anywhere. The truckers rose to their feet one by one, showing their unity and strength. Mac and Jimmy flanked Ray, their expressions hard and unyielding. Blade's gaze swept over the group, and he saw how prepared they were. He realized he didn't have much time left. You don't learn, do you? He said softly. This is your last chance to turn around. Leave, Blade laughed, his voice cold but lacking conviction. You really think you can scare us? Ree's faint smile returned. I don't need to scare you. I just need to remind you what happens when you push people too far. Blade's challenge hung in the air like a storm cloud. The Iron Serpents spread out across the diner, their prey's overwhelming tank. He stepped forward, his broad shoulders almost blocking the light from the entrance while Razor moved toward the counter with a smirk. Ghost lingered near the door, his quiet intensity unsettling. Ray stood his ground, his gaze locked on Blade. You don't want this fight, he said, his tone calm but firm. You're outnumbered and you know it. Blade chuckled, though the sound lacked its usual bravado. Out doesn't mean outmatched, he replied. We've handled worse. Jimmy was seated nearby, leaned forward slightly, a little unsteadily. Not like this, he said, his voice soft but firm. You haven't. The truckers remained calm and collected, their unity a quiet but unmistakable force. Max shifted his weight, his arms crossed as he watched Tank with sharp eyes. Frank, standing near the jukebox, cracked his knuckles, his imposing frame a silent warning to the bikers. Pete peeked out from the kitchen, his face pale but determined. Lisa and Sarah stood behind him, their expressions a mix of fear and resolve. Stay back, Pete whispered to them. Let the guys handle. This Blade stepped closer to Ree, his smirk returning. You like giving speeches, don't you think it makes you look smart and strong? Ray's voice didn't waver. It's not about looking strong, it's about standing for what's right. Blade sneered, that's cute. Let's see how far that gets you. Tank moved suddenly, grabbing a chair and flinging it across the room. It smashed against the wall, the sound reverberating through the diner. Lisa let out a small gasp from the kitchen doorway, and Pete instinctively moved to block her view. Ray didn't flinch, he raised a hand, signaling the truckers to hold their positions. That's enough, he said, his voice sharp. If you're trying to scare us, it's not working. Tank sneered. His fists tightened. Oh, I'm just getting started, he said. The room was filled with a palpable sense of unease, the atmosphere thick with the threat of violence. Ree remained calm and collected, his steady presence helping to keep the truckers focused. Jimmy leaned forward slightly, his muscles tensed. Mac adjusted his stance, his gaze fixed on Tank. Blade took another step towards Ree, his smirk now a thin line of frustration. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, his voice laced with exasperation. "Just back down and we'll leave." Ray's eyes narrowed. "You've said that before, and yet here you are." The other trucker. The others chuckled softly, their quiet defiance further agitating Blade. He clenched his fists, his frustration bubbling over. "Fine," he growled. "If you want to play it this way, let's see how tough you really are." At his signal, Tank lunged forward, aiming a punch at Mac. But Mac was ready. He sidestepped the blow with surprising agility and countered with a solid shove, sending Tank stumbling backward. Jimmy moved in quickly, grabbing Tank by the arm and twisting. Tank let out a grunt of pain as he struggled against Jimmy's grip. The other bikers hesitated, their earlier bravado faltering. Razor moved towards Ray, but Frank intercepted him, stepping in with a sharp warning. "Don't," Frank said simply, his deep voice carrying a weight that stopped Razor in his tracks. Blade watched the scene unfold, his frustration mounting. "You think this is over?" he shouted, his voice cutting through the commotion. "We're not done." Ray stepped forward. His voice was calm but firm. "You are you, just not yet." Blade's scowl deepened, but he didn't move. He glanced around the room, taking in the unyielding stance of the truckers. They weren't scared, they weren't backing down. For the first time, Blade seemed to realize he was losing control of the situation. Tank was still held firmly by Jimmy. Tank grumbled through gritted teeth. "Boss, what do we do?" Blade hesitated. His pride was warring with him. With the reality of their position finally sinking in, he raised his hands in mock surrender. "All right," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You win this round." Jimmy released Tank, who staggered back with a glare. The other bikers began retreating, their earlier confidence now replaced with quiet frustration. Blade lingered for a moment longer, his gaze locked on Ree. "This isn't over," he said, his tone low and threatening. Ray's response was measured. "It is if you want it to be," he replied. He didn't reply, but turned on his heel and strode towards the door. His crew followed close behind, their motorcycles roaring to life as they sped off into the night, leaving the truck stop in an intense silence. Inside, the truckers exchanged relieved glances. Max straightened his shirt with a smile and said, "Guess they're not as tough as they thought." Jimmy chuckled, rubbing his shoulder, and replied, "They're persistent, I'll give them that." Pete emerged from the kitchen, his face a mix of exhaustion and relief. "Do you think they'll come back?" he asked quietly. Ray watched the horizon for a long moment before answering. "If they do, we'll be ready." Lisa approached cautiously. "Are you sure we can keep handling this?" Ray turned to her. "We can. As long as we stick together, there's nothing they can do to break us." Lisa managed a small smile, her confidence slowly returning. The truckers began to settle back into their seats, their unity stronger than ever. Thankfully, the truck stop was safe for now, but everyone knew the Iron Serpents weren't finished. When they returned, the truckers would be ready. The truck stop returned to an uneasy calm after the Iron Serpents roared away. Chairs were upright again, broken glass swept into piles, and the truckers resumed their quiet camaraderie. Despite the relief, no one could shake the feeling that this wasn't the last they'd see of Blade and his gang. Lisa wiped down the counter. Hands still trembling slightly, she said softly, her eyes darting towards Ray. "It feels like they're testing us." Ray nodded as he helped Pete stack chairs against the far wall. "They want control. Every time we stand up to them, it chips away at the image they've built for themselves. They won't stop until they either win or realize they can't. We can't let him win next time he shows up. We've got to stand our ground, Mac. We can't let them think they've got a chance to run this place. If we push them hard enough, they'll eventually crack." Ray set a chair down and straightened his calm gaze, sweeping across the room. "It's not about pushing. It's about standing firm. If we let them drag us into their game, we lose no matter what." The truckers nodded their heads in agreement. It was so lovely to see how much respect they all had for Ree. They were all quietly in agreement. Ree had become their deal leader, and a really calming presence in the storm that the Iron Serpents had brought to their doorstep. Even Pete, who had been a little unsure at first about standing up to the gang, seemed more resolute now. "They're just cowards," Pete said, his voice firmer than before. "They only act tough when they think no one will fight back, and they've never faced anyone like us," Mac added, crossing his arms. "Let them come." Well, meanwhile, miles away at the gang's hideout, Blade was feeling pretty frustrated. He paced back and forth in the dimly lit space, and his crew watched him with concern. Tank sat on a battered crate, nursing his bruised pride. Razor leaned against the wall, arms crossed, while Ghost quietly tinkered with a knife. His expression was unreadable. This isn't over, Blade growled, his fists clenched. Oh, they think they can embarrass us and make us look weak. Well, we'll show them exactly who they're dealing with. Tank finally spoke up. His voice was rough, but he was ready to go. What's the plan, boss? We've gone in twice and they haven't budged. If we go back without something new, we're just spinning our wheels. Blade stopped pacing. His eyes narrowed. We'll hit them harder and smarter. We'll catch them when they least expect it. Razor frowned. They're ready for us. Blade, every time. When we arrive, they're standing there like they've been waiting all night. Blade turned sharply, his glare cutting through Razor's words. Then we make sure they're not ready. We go in fast and hit them where it hurts. Ghost spoke for the first time. His voice was low and measured. If they fight back, Blade sneered. Then we remind them who we are at the truck stop. The truckers were settling in for what they knew would be another long night. There was a sense of community. The sense of community was stronger than ever, and even the tension seemed lighter as they shared stories and jokes over coffee. Lisa and Sarah brought out plates of food, their smiles more genuine now that they had seen what the truckers were capable of. You know, Lisa said as she placed a plate of eggs in front of Jimmy, I think you might actually scare them. Jimmy grinned, taking a bite. I hope so. They need to know they're messing with the wrong group. Mac chuckled from across the room. I hope they're smart enough to figure it out before they get themselves hurt. Ree was sitting near the window, keeping his gaze fixed on the horizon. He listened to the chatter around him, his calm presence grounding the group. But in the back of his mind, he knew Blade wasn't finished. Men like him didn't back down easily, especially when they were riding and it was on the line. As the hours ticked by, the truckers grew quieter, their anticipation mounting. Pete checked the clock repeatedly, muttering under his breath. If they're coming, it'll be soon. Lisa approached Ree. Her voice low, she asked, What do you think they'll do? Ree responded thoughtfully. They'll try to catch us off guard and make us feel like we're not safe here. Lisa frowned. Are we? Ray glanced at her. His gaze was calm and steady. As long as we're together, we're safe. The sound of distant engines broke the quiet. The low rumble cut through the stillness of the night. The truckers, they exchanged knowing looks, their earlier chatter replaced by a focused determination. Ray stood, his movements deliberate, and the others followed suit. They're here, Mac said, his voice low. Jimmy remained at the counter, his broad shoulders blocking part of the entrance. Ray stayed near the window, his sharp eyes never leaving. The door creaked open, and Blade stepped inside. He surveyed the room with a smirk on his face. Did you miss us? He said, his voice laced with mockery. Ree stepped forward, his calm presence filling the room. Not at all, he replied, his voice even. I'm starting to wonder how many times you need to lose. Before you get the message, Blade's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. Do you think we're losing? No, old man, we're just getting started. Ree's voice was steady. Then this is where it ends. Blade's smirk twisted into a sneer. Do you really think you've got us beat? You're just a bunch of truckers playing tough. We're the Iron Serpents and we don't back down. Ree stepped closer, his calm presence unwavering. Blade's posturing was a bit unnerving, but that's probably just because he's so confident. He said, You don't know when to stop, even when you're out of your depth. The truckers silently moved into position, their unity and unspoken message to the bikers was clear. This wasn't a battle they could win. Max stood tall by the door, his arms crossed like an immovable wall. Jimmy adjusted his stance, his eyes fixed on Tank, who seemed ready to pounce. Frank took up position near the Blade's eyes darted around the room, his confidence wavering as he realized just how prepared the truckers were. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. You think standing together makes you strong? Well, all it means is you'll fall together. A pack of men into battles you can't win, Tank growled, stepping forward. Let's settle this before he could move. Mac raised a hand, his voice calm but firm. Don't you've already embarrassed yourself twice? Don't make it worse, Tank hesitated, his anger clashing with the reality of Max's words. Even he could see the truth. Every move they'd made had been met with unyielding resistance. Blade, however, wasn't ready to let go. You don't scare me, he said, his voice full of affectionate teasing. I'm just not afraid of you, that's all. Ree took another step forward, closing the distance between them. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of authority. We don't need to scare you. You've already lost, and every time you come back, you'll lose again. The bikers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bravado cracking under the pressure of the trucker. Razor, always the most cautious, stepped closer to Blade. Boss, he said quietly. Maybe it's time to admit defeat. This isn't going anywhere. Blade shot Razor a look, but the other bikers were murmuring, and it seemed like they were losing faith. Even Tank, who had been the loudest advocate for confrontation, seemed less certain. Ray didn't wait for Blade to respond. "This is your last chance. Leave now and don't come back." Blade hesitated. Pride and fear were holding him back. He finally gave in, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Fine," he said, his voice dripping with bitterness. "You win this time." He turned sharply, signaling his crew to follow. The iron serpents began filing out, their earlier menace replaced by quiet frustration. Tank shot one last glare at Mac as he passed, but he didn't say a word. Blade stopped at the door, looking back at Ree with a smirk that barely hinted at his defeat. "You think you've seen the last of us," he said, his tone lighthearted. Old man Ree's calm gaze didn't waver. "I know I have, because if you come back you won't just be dealing with us, you'll be dealing with the law." Blade's smirk faltered, but he didn't reply. He pushed the door open and stepped outside, his crew following close behind. The roar of their motorcycles faded into the night, leaving the truck stop in an intense silence. Inside, the truckers slowly began to relax. Mac leaned against the wall, letting out a low chuckle. A soft chuckle. "Well, it looks like they finally got the message." Jimmy nodded his head, and his shoulders relaxed as he sat down. "It took them long enough." Pete emerged from the kitchen, looking a little tired but also really happy. "You think they're really gone this time?" Ray turned from the window and his gaze softened. "They are. Blade knows he can't win here, but he just needed to see it for himself." Lisa and Sarah stepped out looking a little cautious, but their expressions were bright. They saw the truckers beginning to smile. Lisa approached Ray, her voice soft and hesitant. Her voice was soft as she said, "Thank you." Ray gave her a small nod. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "This place is a community. We protect each other." Sarah patted Lisa on the back. Her voice was warm. "He's right," she said. "And we're lucky to have him." The truckers began putting the diner back in order. Their laughter and banter returned as the weight of the night lifted. Mac clapped Ray on the shoulder as he passed. "You know," he said, "you've got a." Ray let out a hearty chuckle. "Ever think about running for mayor?" he asked, his eyes twinkling. Jimmy raised his coffee cup in a playful toast to Ray and to keeping this place ours. The other truckers echoed the sentiment with a hearty laugh. Their camaraderie filled the room with warmth. Ray watched the horizon with a smile. He knew that no matter what challenges came their way, this community would stand together, unshaken and unbreakable.